Ladies and gentlemen, today I will speak about one of the most infamous prisons in American history, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Located on a rocky island in the chilly waters of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz is more than just a former prison. It is a symbol of isolation, mystery, and resilience. Alcatraz, often known as the Rock, became a federal penitentiary in 1934. It was designed to house the most dangerous and unmanageable criminals, individuals who had proven too difficult to contain in other prisons. This isolated island, surrounded by frigid and treacherous waters, made it an ideal location to prevent escape and maintain strict security. Throughout its 29 years of operation, Alcatraz became home to some of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. Among its infamous inmates were Al Capone, one of the most feared crime bosses of the 20th century, and Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, who became an expert on bird diseases while incarcerated. Life on Alcatraz was anything but easy. Prisoners lived under strict rules, and privileges were limited to basic necessities: food, shelter, and medical care. The prison's design focused on solitary confinement and minimal interaction, reinforcing the feeling of isolation. Despite its formidable reputation, escape attempts were frequent, but rarely successful. Over the years, 36 prisoners tried to escape in 14 separate attempts. The most famous escape occurred in 1962, when three inmates, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, engineered a daring breakout. Using makeshift tools, they tunneled out of their cells and fled into the dark waters of the bay. To this day, their fate remains a mystery. No bodies were ever recovered, leaving people to wonder if they survived. The daily life of a prisoner at Alcatraz was strictly regimented. Inmates followed a rigid schedule, with days filled with work, silence, and solitude. The prison's harsh conditions were intentional, to break the spirits of the most hardened criminals and deter others from crime. By 1963, however, Alcatraz's time came to an end. Rising operational costs and deteriorating infrastructure made it impractical to maintain. The prison closed its doors, and the remaining inmates were transferred to other facilities across the country. Although it no longer functions as a prison, the legacy of Alcatraz lives on. It has inspired countless movies, books, and legends, capturing the public's imagination with its stories of crime, punishment, and daring escapes. Today, Alcatraz stands as a National Historic Landmark, drawing over 1 million visitors annually who walk through its eerie cell blocks and hear the echoes of its storied past. In conclusion, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary is more than just a relic of America's criminal justice system. It is a reminder of human resilience, the consequences of crime, and the fine line between freedom and captivity. Its walls hold secrets and stories that continue to fascinate and intrigue us to this day. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary is one of the most iconic and mysterious prisons in American history. Situated on Alcatraz Island, approximately 1.25 miles, 2 kilometers, off the coast of San Francisco, California, the prison's location made it nearly impossible to escape. The island itself is small and rocky, rising sharply out of the cold and unpredictable waters of San Francisco Bay. This geographic isolation was a key factor in its selection as a site for a maximum security prison. The island's history, however, predates its use as a federal penitentiary. Long before it became synonymous with hardened criminals and daring escape attempts, Alcatraz served a variety of purposes. In 1775, it was first documented by the Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala, who named it La Isla de los Alcatraces, meaning Island of the Pelicans, due to the large population of seabirds nesting on its rocky cliffs. For much of the 19th century, the island was used as a military fortification and later as a military prison during the Civil War. Its natural isolation and defensive position made it a strategic asset in protecting San Francisco's harbor. It wasn't until 1934 that the U.S. Department of Justice transformed Alcatraz into a federal penitentiary. This decision was driven by the need for a facility to house the most dangerous and incorrigible criminals, those who were considered escape risks or who posed a threat to other inmates and staff in traditional prisons. The federal government wanted a place where the most notorious criminals could be securely contained, and the isolated, unforgiving environment of Alcatraz Island seemed perfect for the job. The prison itself was designed to be escape-proof. Surrounded by the frigid waters and strong currents of San Francisco Bay, even the most determined inmates faced nearly insurmountable odds if they attempted to break free. Alcatraz was not just a place of confinement, it was a symbol of ultimate punishment. Prisoners who were sent to Alcatraz were often those who had caused trouble in other federal prisons. This wasn't just a facility to hold criminals, it was a place to break their spirit and deter others from following in their footsteps. Alcatraz was a small prison compared to others. It had 336 cells arranged across 4 cell blocks. A, B, C, and D, however, it was never filled to capacity. On average, it held about 260 inmates at a time, ensuring strict control and surveillance. Each cell measured approximately 5 feet by 9 feet, providing just enough space for a bed, a small table, and a toilet. The stark, concrete walls and iron bars created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and isolation. One of the most distinctive features of Alcatraz was its psychological impact on inmates. The proximity to San Francisco meant that prisoners could often see the city's skyline and, on quiet nights, hear the sounds of music, laughter, and life drifting across the bay. This cruel reminder of the world just beyond their reach was considered part of the prison's punishment. Many inmates described the psychological torment of knowing freedom was so close, yet utterly unattainable. Alcatraz wasn't merely a prison. It became a symbol of the federal government's commitment to law and order during an era when crime rates were rising and organized crime syndicates were flourishing. This facility represented the end of the line, a place where the most unmanageable and dangerous criminals were sent when no other prison could contain them. For nearly 3 decades, Alcatraz stood as America's most formidable prison, reinforcing the idea that crime did not pay and that those who broke the law would face severe consequences in the harshest of environments. The transformation of Alcatraz Island into a federal penitentiary was not an overnight decision, but rather the result of a growing need within the United States for a prison that could securely house the nation's most dangerous and unmanageable criminals. While Alcatraz had already served as a military prison for decades, it was in the early 1930s that the U.S. government recognized the need for a new kind of facility, one that would symbolize federal authority and reflect the nation's tough stance on crime. During the Prohibition era and the years following, the United States faced a surge in criminal activity. This period saw the rise of organized crime, with notorious gangsters leading multi-million-dollar bootlegging operations, committing violent crimes, and evading law enforcement through bribery and intimidation. Criminals such as Al Capone, George "Machine Gun" Kelly, and Albert Bates became household names, representing a new breed of criminal who is not easily controlled by the traditional prison system. Existing federal prisons struggled to contain these high-profile inmates as escapes, riots, and corruption became pressing concerns. In 1933, under the leadership of Attorney General Homer Cummings and Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons James V. Bennett, plans were made to convert Alcatraz Island into a maximum security, minimum privilege federal penitentiary. The isolated location of Alcatraz, surrounded by the cold, treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay, made it the ideal site for a prison where escape seemed nearly impossible. The federal government viewed the creation of Alcatraz as a way to house criminals who posed the greatest security risks, those who were violent, had attempted to escape from other prisons, or were considered too dangerous to mingle with the general prison population. The official conversion of Alcatraz Military Prison into Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary began in 1934. The project was managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who reinforced the already sturdy military structures with additional security measures. The prison's architecture was designed with security and containment as the top priorities. Steel bars, electronically operated gates, gun galleries, and guard towers were added to ensure constant surveillance and restrict inmate movement. Special attention was given to the cell house, where inmates would spend the majority of their time. Each cell was 5 feet by 9 feet, deliberately small and confining to increase the psychological burden on prisoners. The prison officially opened on August 11, 1934, with the transfer of its first group of inmates. These prisoners were brought from the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, a maximum security facility that had struggled to contain some of the country's most notorious criminals. The first 137 prisoners arrived under heavy guard and were carefully processed into Alcatraz's new system, which emphasized strict discipline, minimal privileges, and total isolation. In the eyes of federal authorities, Alcatraz was not meant to be a place of rehabilitation. Instead, it was designed to punish and contain, a prison where inmates would face the full weight of their crimes through severe confinement and constant surveillance. The establishment of Alcatraz was also meant to serve a symbolic purpose. At a time when the public was growing increasingly fearful of organized crime, the federal government wanted to send a clear message: no one was beyond the reach of the law. The presence of Alcatraz, an impenetrable fortress in the middle of a cold and unforgiving bay, was a powerful reminder that those who defied the law would face absolute punishment in the harshest conditions. From the outset, Alcatraz was intended to house the worst of the worst. Prisoners sent there were not ordinary criminals. They were individuals who had caused problems in other prisons or whose crimes had captured national attention. This included gangsters, bank robbers, and inmates with a history of violence toward staff or fellow prisoners. Alcatraz was the last stop in the federal prison system, reserved only for those who could not be controlled elsewhere. Despite its harsh reputation, the prison operated under a system of strict but fair rules. Warden James A. Johnston, the first warden of Alcatraz, implemented a rigorous schedule and an unyielding code of conduct. Johnston believed that a system of order and discipline was the only way to manage such a dangerous population. Inmates were not given access to rehabilitation programs or luxuries available in other prisons. The only rights guaranteed to prisoners were food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else had to be earned through good behavior. The opening of Alcatraz marked a turning point in the American penal system. It became a model for high-security incarceration, demonstrating that there was a place where even the most dangerous criminals could be securely contained. For nearly 3 decades, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary stood as the most feared prison in the United States, a place where the worst offenders were sent, and from which no one was expected to escape. The primary purpose of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was to serve as a high-security prison designed to house the most dangerous, incorrigible, and escape-prone criminals in the United States. Unlike other federal prisons, which focused to some degree on rehabilitation, Alcatraz's mission was straightforward: to isolate, punish, and securely contain those who posed the greatest threat to society and the prison system itself. By the early 1930s, the United States faced a growing crime wave, particularly during the Prohibition era and the Great Depression. This period saw the rise of notorious gangsters, bank robbers, and organized crime syndicates who exploited weak points in the justice system. Many of these criminals were not only skilled at evading capture, but also had the resources to bribe guards and orchestrate elaborate escape plans. Existing federal prisons struggled to maintain order, as riots, violence, and frequent escapes became increasingly common. The federal government recognized the need for a maximum security institution that would send a clear message: the most notorious and uncontrollable criminals could and would be contained. Alcatraz was chosen for this purpose, due to its natural isolation. Located on an island surrounded by the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay, it was an ideal location to prevent escape. The difficult currents, cold temperatures, and geographic remoteness created a natural barrier that made escape attempts not only unlikely, but also life-threatening. When Alcatraz officially became a federal prison in 1934, its mission was clear: to be the prison of last resort. It was a place to send criminals who could not be controlled by other federal institutions. This included inmates who were prone to violence, those who had attempted or succeeded in escaping other facilities, and high-profile criminals whose influence extended beyond prison walls. Alcatraz became a symbol of ultimate punishment, the final destination for those who had defied the law in the most serious and persistent ways. One of the defining aspects of Alcatraz was its minimum privilege philosophy. Unlike other federal prisons, where inmates had opportunities for education, job training, and recreation, Alcatraz was designed to strip away all but the most basic human rights. Prisoners were guaranteed food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else had to be earned through consistent good behavior. This harsh environment was intended to break the spirit of even the most defiant inmates. Prisoners sent to Alcatraz were often considered problematic or unmanageable in other prisons. Many had a history of violent behavior toward guards or fellow inmates, while others had attempted to escape multiple times. Alcatraz was intended to be a deterrent, not only for those within its walls but also for criminals outside. The federal government wanted to make it clear that once an inmate was sent to Alcatraz, there was no hope for escape and no path to an easier life. The structure of daily life on Alcatraz reinforced this purpose. Inmates lived under a strict code of silence, meaning that for much of the day, they were prohibited from speaking unless directly addressed by a guard. This policy was designed to isolate prisoners not just physically, but psychologically. By cutting off communication and reducing human contact, prison officials aimed to prevent the development of escape plans or organized resistance. Additionally, the prison was built with multiple layers of security to prevent escape. Each cell was individually locked, and movement between areas of the prison was tightly controlled. Guard towers equipped with armed officers overlooked the island 24 hours a day. Prisoners were counted 13 times a day to ensure no one was missing. Even within the prison walls, inmates were under constant observation. Alcatraz also served an important political and symbolic function. At a time when organized crime bosses seemed untouchable, the federal government wanted to demonstrate its ability to maintain control. By placing infamous criminals in an inescapable prison, authorities aimed to reassure the public that justice would be served and that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. Moreover, Alcatraz was intended to separate the most disruptive criminals from the general prison population. Officials believed that by isolating these troublemakers, other federal prisons would become easier to manage. This idea of containing the worst offenders on an isolated island was part of a broader strategy to reduce violence and unrest in the rest of the prison system. The harsh and isolated nature of Alcatraz also reflected a particular philosophy of punishment prevalent during the early 20th century. There was little focus on rehabilitation. Instead, the goal was to punish through deprivation and isolation. This punitive approach was intended to break down the will of prisoners and discourage other criminals from engaging in violent or disruptive behavior. In essence, Alcatraz was more than just a prison, it was a statement. It embodied the federal government's determination to contain the most dangerous elements of society and prevent further criminal activity. Through isolation, strict discipline, and a lack of privileges, Alcatraz sought to render its inmates powerless and serve as a chilling warning to anyone who might consider following in their footsteps. Throughout its 29 years of operation, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary housed some of the most infamous criminals in American history. The prison was specifically designed for inmates who were considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too escape-prone for other federal facilities. These individuals were often already notorious for their crimes or became famous for their time spent on the rock. Alcatraz was not intended to rehabilitate these men. It was a place to contain and isolate those who posed the greatest threat to society and the prison system itself. One of the most legendary inmates to be confined at Alcatraz was Al Capone, also known as Scarface. Capone was one of the most powerful crime bosses during the Prohibition era, running a vast criminal empire in Chicago that included illegal alcohol distribution, gambling, and racketeering. By the early 1930s, his reign of terror, including violent turf wars and the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, made him a national symbol of organized crime. Convicted of tax evasion in 1931, Capone was initially imprisoned at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. However, due to concerns about corruption and his ability to manipulate prison staff, he was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934 as one of the first inmates. At Alcatraz, Capone found himself stripped of the privileges he had enjoyed in other prisons. The strict isolation and harsh conditions took a toll on his physical and mental health, particularly as he began to suffer from syphilis-induced dementia. He spent 4.5 years on Alcatraz before being transferred elsewhere due to his declining health. Another well-known figure who spent time on Alcatraz was George "Machine Gun" Kelly, a notorious gangster and kidnapper. Kelly earned his nickname from his use of Thompson submachine guns during bank robberies. His most infamous crime was the 1933 kidnapping of oil tycoon Charles Urschel, for which he demanded a $200,000 ransom, an enormous sum at the time. Captured and convicted under the Lindbergh kidnapping law, Kelly was sent to Alcatraz in 1934. Despite his fearsome reputation, Kelly was reportedly a model prisoner who abandoned his gangster persona while on the island. However, his time at Alcatraz served as a powerful reminder to other criminals that the federal government could, and would, bring even the most dangerous figures under control. Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, was another infamous inmate. Stroud had already served decades in prison before arriving at Alcatraz, including time at Leavenworth Penitentiary, where he became known for studying birds and writing books on their diseases. However, despite his intellectual pursuits, Stroud was a violent and unpredictable man, convicted of murder and later killing a prison guard. In 1942, after years of being considered a disruptive and dangerous prisoner, he was transferred to Alcatraz. Contrary to popular belief, Stroud was not allowed to keep birds on Alcatraz. He spent much of his 17 years there in solitary confinement, maintaining a reputation as an intelligent but deeply antisocial figure. Another violent and notorious inmate was Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, who holds the distinction of being the longest-serving prisoner on Alcatraz. Karpis was a leading member of the Barker-Karpis gang, responsible for numerous bank robberies, murders, and kidnappings during the 1930s. He was captured in 1936 after being declared public enemy number one of the few criminals to receive that title. Karpis spent 26 years on Alcatraz, during which time he reportedly remained quiet and compliant, though he never stopped resenting the harsh conditions and lack of freedom. His long imprisonment symbolized the government's unwavering commitment to punishing those who posed a significant threat to public safety. In addition to these famous figures, Alcatraz also held many other criminals whose stories captured public imagination. Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin became household names after their 1962 escape attempt, one of the most daring and mysterious episodes in the prison's history. These men meticulously crafted dummy heads out of soap, paper, and hair to fool guards during nightly bed checks, then escaped through ventilation shafts and disappeared into the cold, treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. Whether they survived remains unknown, and their escape only added to Alcatraz's mystique as both an impenetrable fortress and the site of one of the most legendary prison breakouts ever attempted. Not all inmates of Alcatraz were gangsters or infamous murderers. Some were transferred simply because they were disruptive or deemed escape risks at other facilities. These included men like James Whitey Bulger, a mob boss who would later become infamous for his control over organized crime in Boston, and Roy Gardner, a skilled bank robber and escape artist. Each of these inmates contributed to the prison's reputation as a home for America's most dangerous and unmanageable criminals. The inmates of Alcatraz were not just criminals, they became symbols of the federal government's resolve to enforce the law and maintain order. The harsh conditions and isolation of the prison were intended to send a message to the nation that crime would not go unpunished. Each notorious figure who entered the gates of Alcatraz added to its legacy as the ultimate prison, a place where freedom was impossible and where even the most feared criminals were brought to heel. Life inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was designed to be strict, monotonous, and devoid of comfort. The prison operated under a regime of discipline and control, where every aspect of an inmate's life was regulated and closely monitored. Alcatraz was not a place for rehabilitation or reform. It was a place of punishment and containment. For those incarcerated on the Rock, daily life was marked by isolation, routine, and the constant reminder that escape was nearly impossible. Upon arrival, new inmates were stripped of their belongings, given a prison uniform, and assigned a cell. Each cell measured approximately 5 feet by 9 feet, with a steel bed frame, a thin mattress, a small table, a toilet, and a sink. The walls were cold and bare, providing little to no comfort. There was no privacy. Guards patrolled the corridors, and inmates were under constant observation. Each prisoner was assigned a specific cell in one of the prison's 4 main cell blocks. A block, rarely used for regular inmates. B block, general population housing. C block, general population housing. D block, known as the hole, for solitary confinement and punishment. Inmates followed a rigid daily schedule, and deviation from the rules was met with swift punishment. The day began at 6:30 a.m. with the sound of a loud wake-up bell, signaling the start of the daily routine. After waking, inmates were required to clean their cells thoroughly and stand at attention for morning roll call. Failure to comply with these rules could result in loss of privileges or time spent in solitary confinement. Breakfast was served promptly after the morning roll call. Meals at Alcatraz were surprisingly nutritious and well-prepared, a deliberate policy by Warden James A. Johnston, who believed that feeding inmates properly would reduce tension and violence. A typical breakfast might include oatmeal, eggs, toast, and coffee. Despite the quality of the food, mealtimes were silent and strictly controlled. Inmates were allotted only 20 minutes to eat, and any talking or misbehavior could lead to disciplinary action. After breakfast, inmates were marched in silence to their work assignments. Labor was a critical part of daily life on Alcatraz, and every able-bodied prisoner was expected to work. The prison operated several workshops where inmates performed tasks such as laundry, sewing, metalworking, and maintenance. Some worked in the kitchen, preparing meals under the supervision of guards. Others were assigned to the prison library, organizing books and delivering reading materials to inmates in their cells. For those deemed too dangerous or uncooperative to work, confinement in their cells was the alternative. A key feature of life at Alcatraz was the strict code of silence enforced during its early years. Inmates were required to remain silent for most of the day unless given permission to speak. This rule was meant to break the spirit of inmates by cutting off communication and fostering a sense of isolation. Although the policy was relaxed in the 1940s, the psychological effects of enforced silence remained a powerful reminder of the prison's harshness. Lunch was served at 11:30 a.m., and like breakfast, it was simple but sufficient, usually consisting of soup, bread, and meat. After lunch, inmates returned to their work duties until 4:30 p.m., when the day's labor ended. Once work was finished, prisoners were required to shower under supervision. The showers provided warm water, which was an intentional choice by the prison administration to prevent prisoners from acclimating to the cold bay water in case they attempted an escape. Evening roll call and dinner occurred at 5 p.m. Dinner was typically a heartier meal, often including meat, vegetables, and dessert. As with all meals, the environment was heavily controlled, and any infractions could result in the loss of privileges or solitary confinement. After dinner, inmates had a short period of recreation. Those with good behavior could spend time in the prison yard, an enclosed outdoor area where they could walk, exercise, or play limited games such as baseball or chess. Access to the yard was a privilege, not a right, and misbehavior could result in its revocation. Inmates also had access to the prison library, which was stocked with thousands of books and magazines. Reading became one of the few forms of mental escape available to the prisoners. Inmates could check out books on subjects ranging from history and philosophy to fiction. However, material deemed violent or controversial was strictly prohibited. By 8:50 p.m., the evening bell signaled lights out. Prisoners were locked inside their cells, where they remained until the next morning. Guards conducted nightly counts to ensure no one had escaped. For those confined to D Block, known as the Hole, life was even more brutal. Inmates in solitary confinement were held in total darkness for 23 hours a day, with minimal food and no human contact. Some cells in D Block were strip cells, where inmates were deprived of clothing, mattresses, and even running water as a form of extreme punishment. Communication with the outside world was severely limited. Inmates were allowed to write and receive one letter per week, but all correspondence was censored. Visits were also rare and heavily monitored. Visitors had to be approved by the prison administration, and conversations were conducted through bulletproof glass with no physical contact. Inmates were not allowed to discuss prison conditions or their escape plans during these visits. Despite the harsh conditions, some inmates found ways to cope. Many turned to art, music, or writing to pass the time. The prison offered limited opportunities for creative expression. Some inmates painted or played musical instruments during approved hours. Inmates like Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, spent much of their time studying and writing, although such intellectual pursuits were rare. The daily routine at Alcatraz was intentionally monotonous and devoid of hope. Every aspect of life was controlled to minimize interaction, prevent escape, and break the spirit of the inmates. The prison's strict regimen reinforced its reputation as the toughest prison in the United States. For those who lived behind its steel bars, life was a relentless cycle of isolation, labor, and punishment. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was designed to be the most secure prison in the United States. From its isolated location to the advanced physical and procedural safeguards, every aspect of the prison was created to prevent escape and maintain strict control over its inmates. The prison administration believed that no one should be able to break out of Alcatraz, and to reinforce that goal, they implemented a multi-layered security system that was considered unprecedented for its time. One of the most significant security features of Alcatraz was its geographical isolation. The prison was located on Alcatraz Island, a 22-acre rocky outcrop in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Surrounded by cold, churning waters, the island was a natural fortress. The bay's strong currents, combined with the water's average temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, made swimming to the mainland both physically exhausting and potentially fatal. Even the most physically fit individuals would struggle against the tides, and hypothermia could set in within minutes. This natural barrier made it extremely difficult for anyone to survive an escape attempt. The physical structure of the prison itself was a masterpiece of security engineering. The main cell house was built from reinforced concrete and steel, making it virtually impenetrable. The cells were small and individually locked with heavy steel doors that were controlled from a centralized mechanism. Each cell block was designed to be self-contained, meaning that if one section was compromised, the rest of the prison would remain secure. The bars on the cells were made of tool-resistant steel, making them almost impossible to cut through. Alcatraz had 4 main cell blocks, A, B, C, and D, each with multiple layers of security. Inmates in D block, also known as the Hole, were under the most severe restrictions. This section was reserved for unruly or dangerous prisoners and featured solitary confinement cells that were completely isolated from the rest of the population. Prisoners in this block were deprived of many basic comforts, such as light and human contact, which served as a psychological deterrent to further misconduct. Guarding Alcatraz required an elite and highly trained staff. There were approximately 90 to 100 guards at any given time, ensuring that every section of the prison was under constant surveillance. Guards were carefully vetted and required to undergo extensive background checks to prevent corruption or bribery. Many of them lived with their families in a residential community on the island, meaning they were always on site and available. This proximity allowed for rapid response to any security breach. The prison was also equipped with watchtowers, strategically placed to provide a 360-degree view of the island and the surrounding waters. These towers were manned 24 hours a day by armed guards equipped with high-powered rifles. Guards had shoot-to-kill orders if any inmate was spotted attempting to escape. Bright searchlights were used during nighttime hours to illuminate the prison grounds and surrounding waters, eliminating any potential blind spots. Movement within the prison was tightly controlled. Inmates were subjected to frequent head counts, occurring 13 times a day to ensure no one was missing. Even minor discrepancies in these counts triggered immediate lockdowns and full-scale searches. Prisoners were not allowed to move between areas without strict supervision, and all activities, whether it was eating, working, or recreation, were carefully scheduled and monitored. Each prisoner was assigned a number, which became their primary form of identification. This further dehumanized inmates and reinforced the sense that they were under complete institutional control. Inmates were required to follow a rigid set of rules. Any violation, no matter how small, could result in the loss of privileges, solitary confinement, or additional time added to their sentences. The entrances and exits to the prison were fortified and carefully controlled. The main entrance, known as the Sally Port, was a double-gated system that required guards to unlock one door while keeping the other locked, preventing anyone from rushing through. There were limited access points to the outside world, and every package, visitor, or piece of mail was thoroughly searched and inspected for contraband. Even the prison's plumbing and ventilation systems were designed with security in mind. The air ducts and sewage pipes were narrow and heavily reinforced, making it impossible for inmates to use them as potential escape routes. Showers were unique because they provided warm water, not for comfort, but to ensure that inmates would not become acclimated to the cold temperatures of the surrounding bay. In addition to physical barriers, Alcatraz relied on psychological control to maintain order. The prison's strict code of silence, enforced during its early years, was meant to isolate inmates and prevent them from conspiring. The constant surveillance and loss of privacy created a sense of powerlessness, further discouraging any thoughts of rebellion or escape. Despite these extraordinary measures, some inmates still attempted to escape. Over the years, there were 14 known escape attempts involving 36 inmates. Most of these attempts ended in failure, with 23 captured, 6 shot and killed, and 2 drowning. The most famous escape occurred in 1962, when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanished after digging through their cell walls and crafting rafts out of stolen raincoats. Although the official record states they drowned, their bodies were never recovered, fueling speculation that they may have succeeded. The combination of physical isolation, state-of-the-art security, and psychological intimidation made Alcatraz one of the most secure prisons ever built. It was not just a place of confinement, it was a fortress designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals with no possibility of escape. Despite its reputation as an impenetrable fortress, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was the site of 14 documented escape attempts involving 36 inmates during its 29 years of operation. The prison administration proudly claimed that no one had ever successfully escaped, as official records state that 23 were caught, 6 were shot and killed, and 2 drowned. However, the mystery surrounding 3 missing inmates from the most famous escape attempt in 1962 continues to fuel speculation that Alcatraz's claim of being inescapable may not be entirely true. From the moment Alcatraz opened in 1934, the prison's location and design were intended to discourage escape. Situated on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, the prison was surrounded by treacherous waters with strong, unpredictable currents. The cold temperatures of the bay, ranging between 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, made the possibility of swimming to the mainland incredibly dangerous. For many, the geographic isolation was as much a deterrent as the steel bars and armed guards. Early escape attempts. The first attempted escape occurred in 1936, just 2 years after Alcatraz opened. Joseph Bowers, an inmate assigned to burn trash at the island's incinerator, made a daring move by attempting to climb the fence on the edge of the island. He was immediately spotted by a guard in the watchtower. After refusing to surrender, Bowers was shot and fell to his death on the jagged rocks below. This incident sent a clear message to other inmates. Any escape attempt would be met with deadly force. In 1937, 2 inmates, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe, attempted what became one of the most mysterious disappearances in Alcatraz history. While working in one of the prison's workshops, they managed to file through the bars of a window during a heavy fog, which obscured their movements from the guards. The pair made their way to the island's shoreline and disappeared into the frigid waters. Despite an extensive search, their bodies were never recovered. Prison officials insisted they had drowned, but others speculated that they may have succeeded in reaching the mainland. Another violent escape attempt occurred in 1946 and became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. This was one of the most brutal and deadly events in the prison's history. The plan was led by Bernard Coy, an inmate who had carefully observed the guards' routines. With the help of 5 other inmates, Joseph Kretzer, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, Sam Shockley, and Miron Thompson, they overpowered a guard and seized weapons from the prison armory. Their goal was to unlock the main prison yard door and escape by boat. However, their plan fell apart when they failed to obtain the correct key to the outside gate. For 2 days, the inmates engaged in a violent standoff with prison guards and U.S. Marines who were called in to assist. The escape attempt ended with 3 inmates dead, 2 later executed for their roles, and 1, Clarence Carnes, receiving a life sentence. This event highlighted both the brutality of life on Alcatraz and the extreme difficulty of escaping the prison's formidable security system. The 1962 escape, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. The most legendary and mysterious escape attempt in Alcatraz history occurred in June 1962 and involved Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Their plan was the result of meticulous preparation and careful teamwork over several months. Morris, an intelligent and resourceful inmate with a reported IQ of 133, was the mastermind behind the operation. Using stolen spoons and makeshift tools, the men chipped away at the ventilation ducts at the back of their cells. They worked quietly during music hour to mask the noise and crafted dummy heads from a mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and real human hair to fool the guards during nightly bed checks. Once the ventilation openings were large enough to crawl through, they accessed a hidden utility corridor behind their cells. From there, the men climbed to the roof, crossed over the prison yard, and descended to the island's edge. They used a homemade raft crafted from more than 50 stolen raincoats, which they stitched together and sealed with heat. On the night of June 11, 1962, they launched their raft into the dark, frigid waters of San Francisco Bay and were never seen again. The official prison narrative claims the 3 inmates drowned, but no conclusive evidence has ever been found. The FBI investigation lasted for 17 years, but yielded no definitive proof of their fate. Pieces of the raft and a personal wallet belonging to one of the Anglin brothers were discovered on the shores of Angel Island, leading some to believe that they may have survived the escape. In 2013, a letter surfaced claiming to be from John Anglin, stating that all 3 men had survived and were living in hiding. Although the FBI re-examined the case, the letter's authenticity remains unverified. This escape attempt remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American criminal history and continues to capture the public's imagination. Other notable attempts. Over the years, other inmates tried and failed to escape Alcatraz. Some attempted to swim, only to be recaptured or drowned. John Paul Scott was the only confirmed prisoner to successfully swim from Alcatraz to the mainland in 1962, but he was so exhausted and hypothermic when he reached the shore that he was quickly apprehended. Despite the extreme security measures, these escape attempts revealed the desperation of those imprisoned on Alcatraz. For many inmates, the harsh conditions and the psychological toll of isolation made the risk of death preferable to spending their remaining years on the rock. The legend of Alcatraz's inescapability remains both a myth and a challenge, leaving an enduring legacy of mystery and intrigue that persists to this day. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary housed some of the most notorious criminals in American history. The prison's reputation as the ultimate destination for the country's most dangerous and incorrigible offenders meant that only those considered beyond rehabilitation were sent there. Over its 29 years of operation, Alcatraz became home to a variety of criminals, from infamous gangsters to violent murderers, each with their own chilling stories and legacies. The mere mention of Alcatraz conjured images of these legendary inmates, many of whom became as iconic as the prison itself. One of the most infamous and widely recognized inmates to ever serve time at Alcatraz was Alphonse Al Capone. Known as Scarface, Capone was a notorious Chicago mob boss who dominated the city's criminal underworld during the Prohibition era. At the height of his power, Capone's empire controlled illegal alcohol distribution, gambling operations, and prostitution rings. Despite his involvement in countless crimes, including murder, Capone was ultimately convicted in 1931 for tax evasion, a crime that carried a lesser penalty but was easier to prove in court. Capone arrived at Alcatraz in 1934 as one of the first inmates to occupy the prison. Unlike his time at other facilities, where he had bribed officials and lived in relative comfort, Alcatraz stripped him of his power and privileges. Warden James A. Johnston made it clear that Capone would receive no special treatment. He was confined to a small cell, followed the same rigid schedule as other inmates, and was closely monitored to prevent him from exerting influence over the prison population. During his time on the Rock, Capone's physical and mental health rapidly deteriorated. He suffered from syphilis, which had gone untreated for years, leading to neurosyphilis, a condition that caused cognitive decline and paranoia. Once the most feared man in Chicago, Capone became delusional, even playing banjo with the prison band to pass the time. By 1939, he was deemed too ill to remain in federal custody and was transferred to a medical prison before eventually being released. His time on Alcatraz marked the downfall of one of the most powerful criminals of the 20th century. Another infamous inmate was George "Machine Gun" Kelly, known for his ruthless career as a bank robber and kidnapper. Kelly gained national attention in 1933 when he orchestrated the kidnapping of oil tycoon Charles Urschel. The crime netted Kelly a ransom of $200,000, a massive sum at the time, but led to his eventual capture. His reputation for wielding a Thompson submachine gun earned him the nickname Machine Gun. Kelly arrived at Alcatraz in 1934 and, like Capone, found himself stripped of the fearsome persona he once cultivated. Known for being a model prisoner, Kelly spent his time working in the prison industries, sewing clothes and mending shoes. Despite his violent reputation outside, he was described as quiet and cooperative during his years on Alcatraz. He was eventually transferred to another federal prison, where he remained until his death. One of the most brutal and dangerous men to be held at Alcatraz was Robert Stroud, famously known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Stroud was already serving time for murder when he killed a prison guard in 1916, resulting in a death sentence later commuted to life in solitary confinement. While imprisoned at Leavenworth Penitentiary, Stroud began studying ornithology, raising and caring for birds in his cell. His extensive research and published writings on bird diseases earned him a degree of fame. However, contrary to popular belief, Stroud was never allowed to keep birds at Alcatraz. When he was transferred there in 1942, the prison's strict security measures forbade such activities. Stroud spent 17 years in solitary confinement on Alcatraz, where his antisocial and unpredictable behavior continued. Despite his public image as a gentle bird lover, the prison staff viewed him as manipulative and dangerous. His story was immortalized in the 1962 film Birdman of Alcatraz, although the real Stroud was far more complex and volatile than the movie portrayed. Another name synonymous with Alcatraz is Arthur "Doc" Barker, a member of the infamous Barker Karpis gang. Alongside his mother, Ma Barker, and his brothers, Doc committed a string of bank robberies, kidnappings, and murders during the 1930s crime wave. Captured in 1935, Doc was sent to Alcatraz because of his violent tendencies and escape risk. He would later play a key role in one of the most daring escape attempts in 1939. Along with 4 other inmates, Doc attempted to saw through the cell bars and flee across the prison grounds. Guards intercepted the group, and during the ensuing shootout, Barker was killed, reinforcing Alcatraz's image as inescapable. Alvin "Creepy" Karpis was another high-profile inmate and the longest-serving prisoner in Alcatraz's history. As a leader of the Barker Karpis gang, Karpis was involved in numerous kidnappings and bank robberies, which earned him a spot on the FBI's most wanted list. Arrested by J. Edgar Hoover himself in 1936, Karpis was sent to Alcatraz, where he spent 26 years. Known for his intelligence and cold demeanor, Karpis was considered dangerous but disciplined inside the prison walls. Unlike many of his peers, Karpis survived his time on Alcatraz and was eventually transferred before being paroled in 1969. Alcatraz also held James "Whitey" Bulger, years before he became one of America's most wanted fugitives. Convicted of armed robbery and hijacking, Bulger spent 3 years on the island. His time at Alcatraz reportedly shaped his criminal mindset and hardened his already ruthless personality. After his release, he rose to infamy as the head of Boston's Winter Hill Gang, leading a criminal empire until his capture in 2011. These famous inmates and their stories are part of what makes Alcatraz such a fascinating and chilling chapter in American penal history. Each of these figures, whether a mob boss, a bank robber, or a cold-blooded killer, was drawn to Alcatraz by the government's belief that no one could escape and that the rock would break even the most hardened criminals. Life inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was defined by strict discipline, harsh conditions, and a rigid daily routine. Unlike other prisons where inmates might enjoy some freedoms or privileges, Alcatraz was designed to isolate and control the most dangerous criminals in the United States. From the moment inmates arrived on the rock, their lives were subject to a highly structured and unforgiving environment intended to break their will and enforce absolute obedience. When a new prisoner arrived, they were immediately stripped of their identity and reduced to a number. This was part of the prison's policy to dehumanize inmates and reinforce the idea that they were no longer individuals but mere occupants of the system. Upon arrival, prisoners were given a standard-issue uniform, which included a denim shirt and trousers, as well as basic hygiene items. Each inmate's personal belongings were confiscated, and they were assigned a small cell measuring approximately 5 feet by 9 feet, barely enough space to stretch their arms. A typical day for an inmate began at 6:30 a.m. when a loud bell echoed through the cell house, signaling the start of the day. Inmates were required to wake up immediately, neatly make their beds, and stand silently by their cell doors for the morning head count. Head counts occurred 13 times a day, a relentless system to ensure that no one escaped or went unaccounted for. Failure to comply with these simple routines could result in disciplinary action, including solitary confinement or the loss of privileges. After the head count, prisoners were marched in single file to the mess hall for breakfast. Meals were served 3 times a day, and although the food was considered adequate, there were strict rules governing meal times. Inmates were not allowed to speak while eating, and they had 20 minutes to finish their food before being escorted back to their cells. Meals typically included basic items like oatmeal, eggs, and coffee for breakfast, while beans, potatoes, and meat were common for lunch and dinner. While the food was relatively decent compared to other prisons, it was far from luxurious, and the strict silence enforced during meals added to the isolation prisoners felt. Work was a mandatory part of life on Alcatraz. After breakfast, inmates were assigned to various jobs within the prison. Some worked in the prison industries, which produced items such as gloves, mattresses, and clothing for government use. Others were assigned to tasks like cleaning, laundry, or maintenance. Work shifts were highly regulated and closely supervised by guards. Prisoners were expected to remain productive and focused throughout their shifts. Any sign of laziness or resistance could result in punishment. The prison library was one of the few privileges available to inmates. Prisoners who followed the rules were allowed to request books, which were delivered to their cells. Reading became a means of escape for many inmates, offering a brief reprieve from the monotony and isolation of prison life. However, even this privilege was tightly controlled. Inmates were not allowed to possess newspapers, magazines, or any material that provided current news from the outside world. This deliberate information blackout further reinforced their disconnection from society. Inmates were granted 1 hour of recreation time each day, weather permitting. During this time, they were escorted to the prison yard, a small, enclosed outdoor space where they could walk, exercise, or play games like chess. This brief period of physical freedom was closely monitored by guards posted in watchtowers with loaded rifles. For many prisoners, time in the yard was their only chance to experience fresh air and sunlight, a stark contrast to the dim and confined conditions of their cells. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. Inmates were allowed to write letters, but every piece of correspondence was censored by prison staff. They could receive 1 visit per month, but these visits were non-contact, meaning inmates and their visitors were separated by thick glass and communicated through intercom systems. Conversations were monitored, and any discussion of escape plans or prison conditions was strictly forbidden. One of the most feared punishments on Alcatraz was solitary confinement, known colloquially as the hole. Located in D Block, this section of the prison was reserved for the most disobedient or unruly inmates. Prisoners sent to solitary confinement were locked in total darkness for 23 hours a day, often for weeks at a time. These cells were cold, bare, and silent, intensifying the psychological toll on the inmates. Some prisoners reported hallucinations and mental breakdowns after prolonged time in the hole. This punishment was not only meant to correct behavior, but also to break the spirit of those who defied the prison's rigid system. Despite the harsh conditions, the prison administration believed that good behavior should be rewarded. Inmates who followed the rules could earn small privileges, such as extra library time, music practice, or access to the prison band. However, these privileges could be easily revoked for even minor infractions. This system of reward and punishment reinforced a culture of strict compliance and obedience. One unique aspect of Alcatraz was the silence policy during its early years. Inmates were forbidden to speak unless given explicit permission by a guard. This policy was eventually relaxed, but during its enforcement, it created an atmosphere of profound isolation. For many prisoners, the lack of human interaction was more punishing than the physical hardships. The psychological effects of life on Alcatraz were profound. Many inmates described feelings of loneliness, hopelessness, and paranoia. The combination of isolation, constant surveillance, and severe discipline often led to mental deterioration. Some prisoners, unable to cope with the relentless conditions, attempted suicide or self-harm. The prison's rigid environment was designed to crush individuality and enforce absolute submission, leaving inmates in a constant state of anxiety and despair. Every aspect of daily life at Alcatraz was engineered to reinforce control and security. Whether through strict routines, constant monitoring, or psychological isolation, the prison was a place where inmates had little control over their own lives. The harsh conditions and unyielding discipline made Alcatraz not just a place of incarceration, but a symbol of the federal government's uncompromising stance on crime and punishment. Although Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary officially closed its doors on March 21, 1963, its legacy and cultural impact have endured for decades, capturing the imagination of people around the world. The prison's mystique stems not only from its isolation and notorious inmates, but also from the mythology that has grown around it, stories of brutality, desperation, and the inescapable nature of the Rock. This legacy has left a deep imprint on American culture, influencing films, literature, and public perception of the U.S. penal system. One of the most enduring aspects of Alcatraz's legacy is its reputation as an inescapable fortress. For nearly 30 years, Alcatraz was considered impossible to break out of, with its treacherous waters, strong currents, and constant surveillance serving as natural deterrents to escape. The mysteries surrounding the few daring escape attempts, especially the 1962 escape by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, has fueled speculation and folklore. This particular case, in which the men vanished without a trace, continues to fascinate the public and inspire filmmakers, historians, and amateur sleuths. The lingering question of whether they survived or perished in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay keeps their story alive to this day. Alcatraz's closure in 1963 did not diminish its place in public consciousness. If anything, the prison's closure only heightened its mystique, transforming it from a functional prison into a symbol of harsh justice and the limits of human endurance. In the years following its closure, Alcatraz became a national landmark and a site of historical preservation. Today, millions of visitors travel to Alcatraz Island annually, eager to walk through the cold, narrow cell blocks and experience the haunting atmosphere that once confined some of America's most infamous criminals. Beyond its physical presence, Alcatraz has had a profound impact on popular culture. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films that dramatize the lives of its inmates and the harsh realities of prison life. Perhaps the most famous depiction is the 1979 film Escape from Alcatraz, which recounts the true story of the Morris Anglin escape attempt. This film cemented the prison's image as an imposing and inescapable fortress, while highlighting the determination of those who sought freedom against impossible odds. Other popular films, like The Rock, 1996, took creative liberties by turning Alcatraz into the setting for action-packed thrillers, blending fact and fiction to keep the prison's legacy alive. In literature, Alcatraz has also inspired works that delve into themes of confinement, rebellion, and survival. Memoirs from former inmates, including Alvin Creepy Carpus, provide first-hand accounts of life inside the prison and offer a raw glimpse into the emotional and psychological toll of incarceration. These accounts humanize the prisoners while reinforcing the prison's reputation as a place of unrelenting hardship. Alcatraz's cultural impact extends beyond entertainment and history into social and political movements. In 1969, 6 years after the prison closed, the island became the site of a significant Native American occupation. A group of activists, calling themselves the Indians of all tribes, occupied Alcatraz Island to protest the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans and to demand the return of tribal lands. This 19-month-long protest drew national attention and played a pivotal role in raising awareness about Indigenous rights. The occupation transformed Alcatraz from a symbol of government power into a beacon of resistance, forever linking the island to the fight for civil rights. The prison's architectural and geographical uniqueness also plays a role in its legacy. Perched on a windswept and fog-shrouded island, the menacing silhouette of Alcatraz against the San Francisco skyline evokes a sense of fear and fascination. Its isolated position in the middle of the bay made it both visible and inaccessible, a physical reminder of the consequences of crime. The fact that prisoners could hear the sounds of the city drifting across the water, laughter, music, the bustle of everyday life, only heightened their sense of isolation and yearning for freedom. Moreover, Alcatraz has become a powerful symbol of justice and punishment. It represents the federal government's unyielding stance on crime during a period when organized crime and public enemies posed significant threats to social order. The prison's strict regimen and harsh conditions reflect a philosophy of incarceration that prioritized control and retribution over rehabilitation. For some, Alcatraz serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what awaits those who break the law. For others, it stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, as many inmates found ways to endure and even thrive in the face of extreme adversity. Even today, Alcatraz remains a powerful metaphor in the public imagination. Phrases like being sent to Alcatraz evoke images of isolation, punishment, and inescapable confinement. The prison's legacy continues to shape conversations about criminal justice, prison reform, and the ethics of solitary confinement. Scholars and activists continue to study and debate the psychological impact of such extreme isolation, using Alcatraz as a case study in the human cost of punitive incarceration. As a cultural artifact, Alcatraz continues to inspire and haunt the American imagination. Its story is one of power, rebellion, and the struggle for freedom, a story that resonates not only within the walls of the prison but throughout history and popular culture. Through its enduring legacy, Alcatraz stands as a symbol of both the strength and the fragility of the human spirit. In conclusion, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary remains one of the most iconic and mysterious symbols of America's penal history. Though it ceased operating as a prison over 6 decades ago, its legacy lives on, through the stories of its inmates, the drama of its escape attempts, and the cultural fascination it continues to inspire. It stands as a reminder of a time when the U.S. government sought to demonstrate its uncompromising stance on crime and the limits of human endurance within the harshest conditions. Today, Alcatraz is no longer a place of confinement, but rather a place of reflection, a site where visitors can explore the realities of incarceration, the power of the human spirit, and the lasting impact of a prison that was once thought to be inescapable. Its isolation, mystery, and historical significance ensure that Alcatraz will forever remain more than just an island in San Francisco Bay. It will remain a symbol of justice, struggle, and survival for generations to come.